the environmental simulation chamber usually brought Elise Vance a profound sense of peace. It was the sound of controlled chaos, of variables meticulously calibrated to whisper future possibilities. But today, the hum was a low thrum against her skull, a counterpoint to the relentless reports flashing across her holographic displays. Outside, the city of Eridor, a shimmering testament to human ingenuity, nestled beside the rapidly darkening North Sea, was cloaked in an unnatural bruised twilight. The atmospheric models, once Elise's personal playground of predictive delight, now screamed a single terrifying truth. The Great Freeze was coming, and it was far worse than anyone dared to imagine. Elise, a climatologist whose groundbreaking work on sustainable cold weather habitats had earned her quiet respect in scientific circles, ran a hand through her perpetually disheveled auburn hair. Years she'd spent fine-tuning adaptive biodomes and predicting microclimates. Now, that knowledge was racing against a global cataclysm. What had begun as a severe winter anomaly was now being officially termed a rapid planetary cool-down event. Unofficially, and more accurately, people were calling it the snowstorm apocalypse. Her own personal survival bunker, codenamed Resilience, was her magnum opus, a culmination of her life's work. Designed to be entirely self-sufficient for a small group, it wasn't just a shelter, it was a blueprint for a future, a tiny microcosm of humanity's stubborn will to endure. It was meant for three: herself, Mark, and Sarah. Mark, her fiance, was a whirlwind of charm and carefully cultivated confidence. He moved through the world with the easy grace of someone who expected doors to open for him, and they usually did. He claimed to be in futuristic finance consultant, a vague title that seemed to involve a lot of calls and meetings, but he was always there for Elise. "You're saving the world, love," he'd say, kissing her forehead as she hunched over a console. "Let me worry about the logistics." He was handsome, with warm brown eyes and a smile that could disarm a hostile AI. He often praised her brilliance, urging her to monetize her patents, to think big about the applications of her designs, especially the intricacies of Resilience's energy grid and location. Sarah, her best friend since they were 7, was the effervescent counterpoint to Elise's often serious demeanor. A freelance graphic designer whose projects had been drying up with the economic uncertainty, Sarah was usually found curled on Elise's lab couch, sketching or scrolling through feeds, offering a bright, sometimes irreverent commentary on the world. "Honestly, Elle," she'd said just yesterday, "who needs sunlight when you have your glow-in-the-dark moss and recycled air? You're basically building a 5-star dungeon." She was her closest confidant, the one who knew Elise better than anyone, or so Elise believed. Sarah knew about the emergency food caches, the medical supplies, the contact encryption keys for external relief organizations. Everything. The initial red flags were so subtle, so easily dismissed under the crushing weight of global impending disaster, that Elise barely registered them. Mark's sudden, almost obsessive interest in the precise geographical coordinates of Resilience, hidden deep in the remote northern wilderness. "Just so I can visualize where my super genius fiancé will be hiding us," he'd teased, but she remembered the glint in his eye, too sharp for jest. He'd asked about the protocols for the specialized air filtration system, the emergency power conduit details he'd never cared about before. She rationalized it as him finally grasping the gravity of the situation, wanting to be more involved. Then there was Sarah. Always a little scattered, she'd started showing an unnerving memory for the precise inventory of Elise's most valuable emergency items. "Did you pack the anti-radiation meds in kit Alpha or Beta L? Just checking for my mental list, you know." Or, "That water purification system you designed, the reverse osmosis one, is it really robust enough for 3 people for, years?" Elise had smiled, attributing it to Sarah's newfound pragmatism in the face of apocalypse. After all, everyone was edgy. She even found Sarah in her home office once, her fingers hovering over Elise's secure research terminal. Sarah had jumped, feigning surprise. "Just looking at your pretty graphs, Elle, trying to understand all this brain science you do." Elise had laughed it off, but a tiny knot of unease had formed. Hushed conversations, too, had become commonplace. Mark and Sarah, their heads close, voices dropped low. When Elise entered, they would break apart almost too quickly, their smiles a fraction too wide. "Just discussing dinner plans, Al," Mark would declare, or "Sarah's telling me about her wild artistic dreams. Don't worry your scientific head." Elise, exhausted from days without sleep, trying to make sense of the unprecedented atmospheric collapse, would wave a dismissive hand. She was simply too tired to be suspicious. The world was ending, her research showing a terrifying descent into an ice age not seen in millennia. She couldn't spare the energy for petty anxieties. News channels, once filled with sensationalism, now broadcast increasingly grim and raw official updates. Mass evacuations were ordered in coastal cities. Power grids were flickering across continents. Transportation infrastructure was starting to fail. Panic was indeed mounting, but inside Elise's shared apartment, her little bubble, there was a strange, almost serene calm, carefully maintained by Mark and Sarah. They were her unwavering support column in a world tilting on its axis. "It will be okay, Elle," Mark would whisper, holding her tight as she finally collapsed into bed, the drone of emergency alerts echoing from beyond their soundproofed windows. "We'll be safe, all three of us. You made sure of it." Sarah would bring her endless cups of herbal tea, her eyes wide with what Elise perceived as genuine concern. "Just rest, Elle. You've earned it. We've got your back." And Elise, desperate to believe, had let herself be comforted. This was her family, her anchor. They were going into this new, frozen world together. She had dedicated years, sacrificed so much, creating resilience for their shared future. She had no reason to believe otherwise. The perfect illusion held firm, reinforced by the monumental stress of the impending apocalypse. But beneath the surface, the cracks were already forming, invisible to her tired eyes, soon to be pried open by a truth colder than any snowstorm. The deceptive calm in Elise's apartment shattered abruptly on the day the city went dark. Not entirely dark, but the sophisticated, almost sentient grid of Aerodor, which usually hummed with self-correction and redundant systems, stuttered. Lights flickered, then dimmed to a bare emergency glow. Outside, the atmospheric pressure dropped so sharply it made the ears pop, a chilling prelude to the real force of the Great Freeze. Elise, in the middle of cross-referencing global thermohaline circulation data, felt the sudden lurch in her gut. She'd programmed Resilience's systems to be immune to such failures, but the scale of this collapse was unprecedented. This was it. The precipice. She looked up, heart hammering, to see Mark and Sarah exchanging a look that was too quick, too knowing. It wasn't the look of shared fear or concern for Elise, but something else, a fleeting, almost excited anticipation that made the hairs on Elise's neck stand up. "It's happening," Elise murmured, her voice thin. She moved to her personal console, its backup power kicking in, illuminating her face in a stark blue light. The models show a complete grid failure across the northern hemisphere within the next 12 hours. We need to be ready. Now. "Of course, Al," Mark said, his tone smooth, perhaps a little too eager. "Just tell us what to do." "I'll just prepare some rations," Sarah added, already moving towards the pantry, stocked with the emergency food Elise had meticulously curated. But as she passed Elise's main workstation, Elise saw her glance linger on the secured external hard drive that held the full, unencrypted schematics for Resilience. It was a practiced, subtle movement, almost imperceptible, A cold tendril of doubt began to twine around Elise's gut. Later that evening, as the city descended into a chaotic symphony of distant alarms and panicked shouts swallowed by the growing wind, Elise decided to test her nascent suspicions. She downloaded a critical anomaly report from an obscure Antarctic research station, a dataset she claimed was vital for final adjustments to Resilience's climate control. She purposefully left her secure terminal logged in, though locked, with a specific encrypted file titled Resilience Final Chords, encrypted, placed prominently on the desktop. It was a bait file designed to appear crucial, but containing only corrupted data. She then announced she needed a moment to herself in the sleep chamber, feigning a sudden migraine. She didn't, however, go to the sleep chamber. She slipped into a utility closet across the hall, leaving the door ajar just enough to allow a narrow sliver of sight into her office, and activated a discreet audio recorder on her wrist comm. Through the crack, she watched. It took less than 5 minutes. Mark approached the desk first, his movements practiced. He pulled a small, unmarked USB stick from his pocket, plugged it into the terminal, and began typing. He wasn't trying to guess her password. He was running some kind of bypass script. Sarah, meanwhile, had wandered back from the pantry, clutching a granola bar. She leaned against the doorframe, watching Mark, a faint, almost predatory smile playing on her lips. "Anything good?" she whispered. "Almost there," Mark replied, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Her encryption's tougher than I thought. Good thing I had this little beauty." He gestured with his chin to the USB. Elise's blood ran cold. This wasn't simple curiosity. This was a well-equipped, premeditated attempt to compromise her systems. Finally, a window popped up on Elise's screen. Access granted. Mark quickly clicked on the Resilience Final Chords encrypted file, dragging it onto his USB stick. "Got it," he breathed, a triumphant ring in his voice. Just as she predicted, last-minute adjustments. "You sure this is the right one, though?" Sarah asked, a flicker of doubt. "She's so bloody paranoid about her research. It could be a decoy." Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "Sarah, darling, she's predictable, always updating things at the very last second. This file was created just hours ago. Now, for the real prize." He navigated deeper into her system, bypassing several layers of firewalls that Elise hadn't even known he was aware of. He wasn't just pulling coordinates. He was copying entire blueprints, energy consumption reports, and resource manifests. Every detail of Resilience, her very lifeblood for survival, was being siphoned away. The recorder on Elise's wrist hummed, documenting every click, every hushed word. "So, the plan remains," Sarah said, her voice chillingly devoid of emotion. "Once we have everything, we head for the secondary transport, use her diversion protocol to jam the city's remaining comms, and leave her the decoy bunker." "Precisely," Mark confirmed, unplugging his USB with a satisfied smirk. "She's so immersed in her global models, she won't even realize she's left with an empty shell until it's too late. It'll buy us days, maybe weeks, for her to realize. By then, we'll be snug. And with her schematics, we can easily find a way to patch things up where she cut corners to make it compact." Elise felt a visceral lurch, a pain far deeper than any physical wound. It was a trauma bond, a betrayal so profound it felt like her very soul had been ripped open. Mark, her fiance, who swore to love her, to stand by her. Sarah, her best friend, her confidant since childhood, practically family. They were planning to leave her to die, in the harshest winter humanity had ever known, all to steal her life's work. The decoy bunker they mentioned was the small, minimally provisioned emergency kit she'd prepared for local civic volunteers, a gesture of kindness, not a survival strategy. And her diversion protocol. That was a last resort, region-wide EMP burst designed to disable aggressive autonomous drones the world over that might seek to exploit destabilized power grids. They were going to use her fail-safe to cause even more chaos, masking their escape and ensuring no one could help her or even track her. The rage that surged through Elise was cold, clean, and utterly consuming. The anguish of betrayal was profound, but underneath it, a singular thought began to crystallize. They underestimate me. Deeply. She thought of all the times Mark had subtly pressed for details about Resilience's remote power coupling or the exact frequency of her long-range comms array. She remembered Sarah's seemingly casual questions about the emergency med packs, the specific brand of nutrient paste, even the structural integrity of the main entrance airlock. Every innocent-sounding inquiry was now a poisoned arrow, delivered with a smile. They believed her focus on the global disaster would render her blind, too naive to see the imminent threat in her own home. They saw her compassion as a weakness, her trust as foolishness. But they had misjudged her. Her mind, once consumed by the macro threat of the apocalypse, now snapped into an intensely personal, tactical focus. The world was ending, but she would not let it end for her at the hands of those she had loved. She waited, holding her breath until Mark and Sarah had tidied up, their faces once again assuming masks of concern. They left her office, presumably to gather their own pre-packed bags. Elise slipped out of the closet. Her face, she knew, must be a mask of blank exhaustion, hiding the inferno raging beneath. The external hard drive Mark had copied was indeed a decoy. The real schematics, the true coordinates for Resilience Prime, resided in her mind, encoded in a complex mnemonic web she had built over years, reinforced by a secure quantum-encrypted chip implanted in her forearm, accessible only via her unique biometric signature and a series of cognitive triggers. The files on her computer were secondary, a necessary camouflage. Mark and Sarah had stolen a ghost. A tear pricked her eye, quickly frozen by the chill seeping into the building. It wasn't for her own imminent danger, but for the profound death of trust. But that sentiment quickly gave way to a steely, calculating resolve. She was a scientist, a problem solver. Mark and Sarah were variables, now thoroughly identified, and she knew exactly how to manipulate their next steps. The blizzard was coming, yes, but a storm of her own making was about to hit her betrayers and bury them in ice. The silence in the frigid apartment stretched, punctuated only by the distant howl of the escalating wind and the occasional rattle of ice against the windows. Elise stood in the doorway of her office, the ghost of Mark's smirk and Sarah's chillingly casual instructions echoing in her mind. The raw, searing pain of betrayal still gnawed at her, but it was hardening, crystallizing into something cold and sharp. Purpose. Her brilliant mind, usually dedicated to global patterns and planetary survival, now narrowed with terrifying precision onto a single immediate problem. How to survive this? How could she use her knowledge to outwit two people who believed they held all the cards, the two who had systematically dismantled her trust for their own selfish gain? She closed her eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath, and began to assess her battlefield. First, her assets. At the top of the list was her unparalleled scientific knowledge. She knew the storm, not just the headline news, but the intricate atmospheric pressures, the exact plummeting temperatures, the specific wind shear patterns that would make certain routes impassable, certain shelters untenable. She knew material science, energy systems, predictive modeling down to the microclimate. Then, her secure lab and equipment. Despite their attempts, her most sensitive data, her true sanctuary blueprints, were safe. The quantum encrypted chip in her forearm held the real key in the form of hidden caches. Throughout her life, Elise had always been a contingency planner. Beyond the main survival supplies she'd stocked in her home, she had smaller, strategically placed stashes, a testament to her innate self-reliance, and now they were a lifeline. Lastly, her enemies that were close to her. Her understanding of Mark and Sarah. Their greed, their arrogance, their fundamental belief in their own superiority and her naivete. Their weaknesses included a penchant for comfort and an over-reliance on technology, both of which she could exploit. She then listed her liabilities. The first being time constraints. The storm was hitting, power was failing, communication was dying. Secondly, she had a physical disadvantage. 2 against 1. She couldn't risk a direct confrontation. Then, finally, the worst liability of them all, the emotional toll. The raw grief and anger were a potent motivator, but also a potential distraction if not carefully managed. "They've stolen a ghost," she murmured to the empty room, a faint, grim smile touching her lips. "Let them chase it into the cold." Her counter-strategy began in earnest. The first step, misdirection. Mark and Sarah believed they had the final chord's encrypted file. Elise, however, had foresight. Months ago, during a particularly cynical period of stress when she'd first noticed some minor discrepancies in Mark's finance reports, she'd created a dummy file structure. It mirrored her real encrypted data down to the byte size. She had hoped to never utilize it, but now it had saved her. The stupidly named file Mark had copied contained coordinates, yes, but coordinates for an older, less robust, and critically deactivated survival cache buried deep within the perpetually unstable tectonic fault lines of the Eastern Ridge, a death trap for anyone unaware of its inherent structural flaws. She had even peppered it with references to a critical atmospheric regulator that could only be retrieved from a specific, exposed access point known for its treacherous icefalls. The second step, reinforcing the illusion. She emerged from her office, adapting a look of strained relief. "The models are stabilizing slightly," she announced, forcing a weak smile. "It seems my latest adjustments to the climate control system will make resilience even more resilient than I thought. But it requires sourcing a unique biofilter element. I'd meant to do it last week, but with everything going on." She paused, letting the implication hang. "It's stored at the Oldfield Test Site Alpha, the one near the industrial purification plant. We'll need to go there first before we can fully activate the main systems." Mark's eyes gleamed. He'd recognized the name. Field Test Site. Alpha was a known, isolated location. He likely assumed this was the decoy bunker they had planned to leave her with, and now he could get a head start on securing it for himself. "Of course, Elle," he said too quickly. "I'll get the utility vehicle ready. Sarah, maybe you can help Elle pack the last-minute essentials?" Sarah nodded, a false cheerfulness masking her own calculations. She probably thought Elise was being strategically vague, trying to minimize what she was leaving behind, and they would simply help her gather everything critical from their designated rendezvous point. While Sarah was busy helping Elise pack her pre-selected, deliberately non-critical items, Elise discreetly made several adjustments to ensure her plans will work. Firstly, the utility vehicle. While Mark was retrieving it from their building's underground garage, Elise slipped down to where it was parked. She knew Mark, in his arrogance, wouldn't check the fuel. A quick, precise alteration to the vehicle's fuel mixture, a small vial of specialized additive from her lab that would slowly degrade the synthetic fuel blend, causing it to sputter and eventually fail after about 50 kilometers of driving in extreme cold, was administered. It wouldn't stop them immediately, but it would ensure they'd be stranded far from any help. And crucially, before reaching the Eastern Ridge death trap. Secondly, the emergency rations they believed they were stealing. Elise had subtly replaced many of Sarah's medical kit items with placebo versions, particularly the high-potency antibiotics Mark would rely on due to his compromised immune system caused by years of undisclosed stress. She swapped the concentrated nutrient paste with a high-fiber, low-calorie substitute that would offer only minimal sustenance. Her most vital personal emergency gear, her real meds, her true comms array, were already stashed in a hidden compartment of the smaller, fully independent mini-pod she referred to internally as Elise's final sanctuary. Thirdly, she modified Resilience's true access protocols. The biometric locks she developed were based on more than just fingerprints. They scanned for unique biosignatures, pulse rates, and even minute fluctuations in neural activity patterns. She had introduced a phantom biometric profile, one that would appear to grant access to the bunker, but would actually trigger a full system lockdown and initiate a timed self-destruct sequence, leaving behind only an empty, frozen husk. They would think they had access, but their very attempt would doom it. Finally, while Sarah was distracted making a call about final arrangements, likely with someone else she was roping into their scheme, Elise slipped into the kitchen. She activated a long dormant feature in her smart home system, a complex, timed sequence of power fluctuations and localized electromagnetic pulses. It was designed to mimic a severe grid failure, but also to specifically disrupt the frequencies of the long-range comms Mark and Sarah used. As a bonus, it would briefly scramble the coordinates on the decoy device Mark now held, making them believe their navigation system was glitching, leading them to manually input the faulty Eastern Ridge coordinates she'd planted earlier. "Ready, Al?" Sarah called, her voice tight with anticipation. "Mark's almost back with the vehicle." Elise picked up a small, insulated bag, her face an unreadable mask. "As I'll ever be, Sarah. As I'll ever be." Sarah didn't notice the glint of steel in her voice. The storm raged outside, a symphony of destruction. But inside, Elise felt a calm she hadn't known in days. They had underestimated her, had mistaken her trust for weakness. They had played a game of survival, but they hadn't realized Elise Vance, the climatologist, was also a master chess player, and her pawns, her betrayers, were already moving exactly where she wanted them. The stage was set for their final frozen act. The world outside Eridor evaporated into a maelstrom of white. The wind, which had been a mournful howl, now screamed with the force of 1,000 banshees. Temperatures plummeted even further, a physical punch to the gut that stole sensation from exposed skin in mere seconds. Communication networks had indeed flatlined, the city's remaining emergency lights flickering out one by one as the grid finally surrendered. This was it. The Great Freeze was no longer a distant threat. It was a hungry, encroaching beast, consuming everything in its path. "All right, everything's loaded," Mark shouted over the gale, wrestling with the back hatch of the utility vehicle. He looked exhilarated, a man on the cusp of a great victory, oblivious to the fact that his victory was a carefully orchestrated illusion. Sarah, huddled next to him, shivered, but her eyes held a similar glint of anticipation. They believed this was their escape, their triumph. "Is the biofilter secured, Al?" Mark asked, giving her a pointed glance. Elise clutched her small, seemingly innocuous insulated bag containing her real essentials tighter to her chest. "Yes, right here," she replied, her voice steady despite the seismic tremor of the vehicle, struggling against an unusually strong gust of wind. The fuel additive Elise had administered earlier was already beginning its work. The engine coughed subtly, a tiny hesitation that only Elise, keenly attuned to such minutiae, would have noticed. "Good. Let's get out of this frozen hellhole." Mark slammed the hatch shut. "Sarah, you navigate. I'll drive. As they pulled away from the now darkened residential tower, the city a ghost of its former self, Elise watched the familiar streets disappear behind a curtain of snow. The internal comms in the vehicle crackled with static, a precursor to the EMP pulse Elise had timed to activate just as they passed the abandoned industrial district, a perfect location for maximum disruption to their comms and navigation. "Which way, Sarah?" Mark asked, peering through the rapidly accumulating snow on the windshield. The wipers were already struggling. Sarah tapped at the vehicle's navigation screen, which was displaying the scrambled decoy coordinates Elise had engineered. "Left here, onto the old highway. It shows a clearer path to the field test site Alpha." Mark nodded, turning the wheel precisely where Elise had intended. The utility vehicle designed for rough terrain, but not a full-blown planetary ice storm, groaned. The engine continued its subtle, intermittent cough. "This truck sounds like it's dying," Sarah remarked, a flicker of concern replacing her earlier smirk. "Just the cold, darling." Mark waved it off, his confidence still largely unshaken. "This thing is built like a tank." Elisa remained silent, outwardly calm. Inside, her mind was a whirlwind of calculations. The temperature drop was accelerating faster than even her most pessimistic models. The fuel degradation would hit critical mass within the next 20 kilometers, stranding them in a particularly exposed stretch of ancient forest, far from the false field test site Alpha, nestled near the industrial purification plant. And even if they somehow made it there, the so-called critical biofilter was a dead end. Suddenly, the vehicle's navigation screen glitched wildly. The map dissolved into static, then reintegrated with erroneous coordinates flashing, then vanished completely. At the same moment, the long-range comm unit emitted a piercing shriek of static before dying with a final pathetic pop. "What the hell?" Mark swore, wrestling with the steering wheel as a sudden downdraft slammed into the vehicle. "Lost comms, and the nav is dead." "My phone's useless too," Sarah exclaimed, frantically tapping at her device. "No signal, just static." Elise calmly pulled her own specialized comm unit from her bag. It was a prototype, designed to operate on a closed, quantum-encrypted loop with her true sanctuary, immune to the localized EMP she'd just triggered. She pretended to try and fail to get a signal, then shook her head sadly. "It's the storm, took out everything. We're on our own." Mark's face tightened. "Fine, I know the way. We keep going straight on this highway until we hit the turnoff for Alpha." His voice still held a ring of command, but a hairline fracture of doubt was forming. The drive became a nightmare. Snow piled high, visibility dropped to inches. The utility vehicle's engine began to sputter more violently. Then, with a final groan, it died. "No, no, no!" Mark pounded the dashboard. He tried to restart it, but the engine only coughed weakly, refusing to catch. "Damn it! Fuel line must be frozen!" "We have to walk," Sarah wailed, already looking utterly defeated. The icy wind tore at her thin jacket, a stark contrast to Elise's specially designed, multi-layered survival suit. "The field test site. Alpha is only a few kilometers from here," Elise stated calmly, pointing into the swirling vortex of white. "We can make it. We have to." She was pointing them toward the eastern ridge. Mark looked at her, his eyes narrowed with a flicker of something new suspicion. But then his survival instincts took over. "All right, grab whatever you can carry. We're going on foot." As they bundled up, Elise ensured she took only her small insulated bag. She watched as Mark slung a bulky pack over his shoulder containing the decoy schematics, and Sarah struggled with a bag filled with the placebo meds and low-nutrient paste. They were going to walk into the teeth of the blizzard, laden with useless items, towards a location that would betray them as surely as they had betrayed her. She hardly felt any vindication inside of her now. "What about resilience?" Sarah asked, her voice cracking as the cold bit at her exposed skin. "The main bunker. We need to get there." The main bunker is set up for automatic transfer of all essential systems from Field Test Site Alpha. Elise lied smoothly, forcing warmth into her voice. "Once we activate the biofilter there, Resilience will finalize its systems. It's too extreme to go directly to Resilience. It's deep in an ice canyon now. Alpha is our best bet for activating the primary systems and getting the coordinates for the main Resilience bunker." This was the final gambit. She knew their greed for the main bunker, for the ultimate prize, would drive them, and her carefully planted false data now promised that prize lay just beyond the treacherous trek to the eastern ridge. They began to trek into the blinding white, Mark leading, Sarah struggling behind him, and Elise following, a silent grim reaper in the blizzard's wake. Each step was a battle against the elements, against the encroaching cold. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely less than an hour, the first signs of the Field Test Site Alpha appeared, rusted, skeletal structures barely visible through the swirling snow. The abandoned industrial purification plant Elise had intentionally mapped them to. "We're here!" Mark shouted, his voice cracking with relief, though it was quickly drowned out by the roar of the wind. "The access point, Elise. Where's the critical biofilter?" Elise pointed to a precarious, ice-coated ladder leading up the side of a partially collapsed, heavily corroded tower. "It's in the control room at the top, highly exposed. I warned you about the ice falls." Her voice was devoid of emotion. Mark hesitated, looking up at the dangerous climb, then at the swirling tempest. "You're telling me we have to go up there now?" "We need to activate Resilience," Elise stated simply. "It's the only way." Mark snarled. "Fine, Sarah, stay here. Keep an eye out. I'll go up. Don't touch anything until I get back." He started to ascend, his confidence in Elise's critical biofilter overriding his instinct for self-preservation. As Mark began his treacherous climb, Elise turned to Sarah. Sarah's face was already a mask of frozen despair. She was clearly not prepared for this level of extreme cold. "Don't worry," Elise said, her voice soft, dangerously calm. "He'll be fine. He's got the coordinates for the real bunker, remember? The one we put on my hard drive." Sarah chuckled weakly, a sound half swallowed by the wind. "Good thing, right? Your main bunker is a little exposed." Elise smiled, a genuine cold smile. "Oh, Sarah," she said, pulling a small, discreet device from her insulated bag. It was her personal distress beacon, preset to send a low-frequency pulse to her true sanctuary, the small, robust mini-pod she had prepared years ago, waiting in its camouflaged location just 20 kilometers away. "This isn't my main bunker, but this is." With a sudden fluid movement, Elise kicked her in the back and slipped away from Sarah, melting into the driving snow. Sarah gasped, not even knowing what hit her, realizing in that horrifying moment that she was alone, stranded. She stumbled forward, trying to call out, but the wind tore the sound from her throat. She looked wildly around for Mark, but he was already a distant, struggling figure on the treacherous tower. Elise didn't look back. Her escape wasn't about vengeance, not entirely. It was about survival, about the ruthless application of her intellect. She engaged the built-in microheater in her suit, activated the specialized GPS in her wrist comm that displayed the exact pre-calculated safest route through the blizzard to her true sanctuary. The journey was perilous, her face stung by ice, her muscles screaming with effort, but her mind was clear, focused. She heard faint shouts behind her, swallowed almost immediately. Mark, likely reaching the top of the tower only to find an empty frozen console, realizing the biofilter was a myth, realizing the critical anomaly report was just a trail that led to nothing. Sarah, undoubtedly growing colder, more terrified, her medical kit proving useless. Their desperate calls for her, for help, would fade, unanswered, swallowed by the brutal, indifferent storm. They would be out here alone, knowing that Elise, the one they had looked down on, had outsmarted them. Elise pressed on, fueled by a terrible new strength born of betrayal. The world was being remade by ice, and she was going to be one of its unforgiving new architects. Her true sanctuary awaited. The journey to Elise's true sanctuary was a trial by ice. Each footstep was a brutal assertion against the raging blizzard, the wind a physical force pressing against her every move. Her specialized suit, a marvel of bioadaptive textiles and internal heating, was the only barrier between her and immediate hypothermia. The GPS on her wristcom glowed a steady green, guiding her through the whiteout, a precise line drawn through the chaos to a point only she knew existed. Her lungs burned with the effort, but her mind was remarkably clear, purged of the emotional turmoil that had plagued her for weeks. The cold had a way of stripping everything down to stark necessity. After what felt like an eternity, the faint outline of a rock face emerged from the swirling snow, a familiar landmark. Then, a subtle shimmer in the ice, almost invisible against the natural formations. This was it. Elise's final sanctuary, as she'd privately dubbed it. A compact, purpose-built mini-pod, seamlessly integrated into a natural alcove, camouflaged by years of accumulating snow and ice, powered by an internal geothermal generator and a robust closed-loop biodome. It was small, designed for one, perhaps two at an extreme pinch, but it was impenetrable, self-sufficient, and entirely her own. With a series of precise biometric scans and a unique cognitive sequence, she initiated through her implanted chip. A section of the snow-laden rock face slid away, revealing a small, insulated airlock. Elise stepped inside, the blast doors hissing shut behind her, sealing her from the fury of the world outside. The silence was profound, broken only by the gentle hum of the life support systems. The warmth that enveloped her was more than just physical. It was the warmth of raw, unadulterated survival. She shed her ice-crusted suit, her movements slow, deliberate. As she walked further into the compact, meticulously organized living space, she looked out of the reinforced viewport. The world outside was a swirling canvas of white, a primal wilderness reclaiming what humanity had built. The lights of Eridor were long gone, swallowed by the storm. Mark and Sarah were out there somewhere, likely struggling within the frozen husk of the deception she had meticulously crafted. A wave of exhaustion, both physical and emotional, washed over her. She sat on the small, comfortable bunk, a nutrient paste packet in her hand, but no appetite. There was no triumph in her heart, only a cold, hard sense of inevitability. She had outsmarted them, yes. She had secured her survival, but the cost was immense. Elise slumped against the metal walls of her sanctuary, finally letting out tears she couldn't freeze outside. She had lost her fiance, her best friend, and with them, a large part of her faith in human connection. The illusions of love and loyalty she had clung to were shattered, replaced by the stark reality of self-preservation in the face of apocalypse. She grieved not for their likely fate, but for the naive, trusting part of herself that had been so easily manipulated. She grieved for the future she had envisioned, one where shared strength and intellect would lead to shared survival. That vision was buried under meters of snow. Yet, as she surveyed her small, perfectly functional sanctuary, a new realization blossomed. Her intellect, her foresight, her unwavering commitment to problem-solving, these were her true anchors. She had survived not because of Mark or Sarah, but despite them. Her self-reliance had been tested, and it had proven unbreakable. Elise rose, her eyes scanning the diagnostics on a small console. Her systems were operational. Her biodome was generating oxygen. Her nutrient reserves were solid. She picked up a data pad and began scrolling through her research, not just for survival, but for understanding, for growth. The world had changed. Humanity had been reduced, perhaps catastrophically. But she was here. She had survived. And as she looked out at the silent, frozen landscape, a flicker of that old scientific determination returned. The battle for her personal survival was won, but the larger questions remained. How would humanity adapt? How would life persist on this new, frozen Earth? Elise Vance, the brilliant climatologist, survivor of betrayal and apocalypse, took a steadying breath. The thaw would come, not just for the planet, but for her own understanding of what it meant to endure, and she would be ready. Her work, her true calling, had only just begun.